So I was told that you folks, and I should tell you when I start off, that I was over at the Harvard Business School a couple of weeks ago, in fairness, because they did a case study on one of our companies. And I generally go there to, when they do that particular case, both as a learning experience for myself and also some fun. But I should also tell you that what I've quickly learned, at least with them, is that questions have a tendency to be the more interesting aspect. So while I was told to give a speech, I'll give the speech, but I'm sort of counting on you folks to ask the questions to actually sort of liven it up at the end. And for a guy who comes from PR, as you can imagine, you know, the question and answer part is usually the combative part. And I look forward to that aspect also, because by definition, in a world where perception is so influencing so many different issues right now, good or bad, it's actually probably the most fascinating time for people in my field to operate. I mean, the only thing that was probably even close to this was during the great time when you could basically promote any company you wanted, which was in the 1950s. And since then, it's actually been less of a challenge. Today, it's a challenge. But let me start off by just that, which is we're at a really interesting point in history today. And I know this is a leadership forum, so I'll talk about leadership and a little bit about myself from that perspective. But today, I think it would be fair to say leaders are under more scrutiny than ever before. They face unprecedented challenges. There are very few that remain unscathed once the press begins to look at them. And being a leader today, one would actually have to say, is probably more fraught with peril rather than necessarily opportunity in the short term with respect to enhancing one's reputation, and maybe even given what Congress is doing with respect to taxing individuals who make a lot of money. It's also fraught with economic uncertainty. A few years ago, a researcher who works for us, Dr. Leslie Gaines-Ross, asked some rising stars in business throughout the United States a simple question. If you could be CEO today, would you? Fascinating to me, 1/3 of those executives said at that time that they would turn down the job if offered. And interesting enough, I suspect that today that number would actually go higher. In fact, President Obama, when he was interviewed by 60 Minutes, was asked whether or not he was actually having a hard time finding people to serve in government. And he admitted, and I spent this morning down in Washington, D.C., we actually own one of the largest lobbying firms. So I met with them, and then afterwards we started talking about what's taking place in the administration. But he said what they said to me, which was, it's difficult right now to get people to actually say yes when the president calls to serve in sub-cabinet positions. And they agreed that never before have they had so many people on their own staff who normally would be going into the government at this point in time, basically declining to do so. I think the fact of the matter is that we are at an incredible moment with respect to leadership, or the absence of such. The fears, the perils, the questions that people are asking about whether or not you could succeed in today's world are such that never before have people really said to themselves, do I want to be the number one? That's unique. It's unique in my experience here in the United States, and candidly, when I travel across the globe, we're finding the same issue in many, many countries. When we look to promote people right now, for the first time, we question whether the person is interested in the promotion. Something that has never before happened in my firm's history, let alone in our industry, which has always been a growth industry. This is a unique moment. Now, having said that, I have to tell you, I take a very different view. I take the view that never has been as exciting to be as a leader as today. Never has it been more interesting to potentially step up to the plate and take the assignment to lead an organization. I can't think of a time where it's actually more fascinating to fundamentally grapple with the problems that people are facing as they day-to-day try to grow their businesses, engage with government, talk to all the different constituencies that they have to respond to. So I see it as a great moment, and I think for those of you who are about to graduate, and I know the question about jobs has to be paramount during an economic recession, but putting the short-term moment away, I think it's the best time actually to enter into business, the best time fundamentally to get out there. Now, before I go further about myself or business, let me just tell you a little bit about the public relations industry, because one of the questions that is usually asked is, what is the public relations industry? And so I would start by saying there are a lot of assumptions about what we do. I think the simplest way of looking at it is people who are in public relations are paid advocates, charged with the responsibility by corporations, governments, and nonprofits to communicate a point of view, to influence a debate, to convince people to make a purchase, to have a positive view of a brand, a product, or the service that they're providing. We're ultimately the great persuaders. We're not neutral. We're not nonpartisan purveyors of information. We're not Wikipedia in its purest sense. We are paid to be advocates, to convince people to do something. Purchase something, believe in something, have a conversation about something, but paid advocates. And we use all the things you would expect to get that done. Traditional press, we use the web, we look into product launches and experiential marketing, community engagement, all of the things that one would think that actually would help us influence the target audience that we're trying to reach. Today, I have approximately 5,000 people in 80 countries in 4 continents doing that. We receive in revenue about $1 billion, and we have a pretty strong EBITDA margin. And it's been a growth business for the last 7 or 8, well, actually, frankly, it's been a growth business for the last 20 years, but it has been a particularly good growth business over the last 7 or 8 years, with periods of recession in between during those 20 years. When I was thinking about what I would say today, I actually was, the leadership forum is a little different. Usually I'm asked to talk about what public relations is doing. I went back and some of my notes, and I found a memo I had distributed on July 10th, 2001. It was written to all of the employees of BSMG Worldwide, which was the company I was the CEO of at the time. And what it said was that we were about to become and merge with Shandwick Worldwide and become the world's largest communications firm. I was to become the CEO of that entity. And the memo began like this. It's that time again. For those of us who love change, and let's face it, change has been our middle name for years, we're about to consummate a corporate merger that is the biggest, best, and most exciting change in our company's history. Now, those words, when I read them just last week, struck me as a pretty good description of how I personally got to where I am and what I have tried to impart to the people who I have worked with all these years, which is that fundamentally change is inevitable and change is good. There's a price to change, but change is actually what we can all count on, and if handled the right way, it is a positive to grow a business, build a product line, and basically enhance one's reputation in the world. You know better than anybody else, as people who are studying what is taking place in business today and yesterday, that the rate of change is not going to slow down. In fact, for most of us, it's going to speed up. And whether in life or work, the one thing that I've always found is that you have to basically assume that the only constant you're going to have is change. I said that July 10th memo that change has been our middle name, and I'll give you some sense of how I basically progressed in my career to give you some sense of how it's been part of my lifetime. I graduated from college in '75 and went to work for the Prudential Insurance Company. I didn't work in the Prudential Insurance Company's insurance arm. I worked in the controller's department. Now, 2 things you should know. I was a political science major and knew nothing about finance. In fact, math was what made me a political science major. And I knew even less about insurance. But in 1975, unemployment was higher than it is today. Jobs basically didn't exist. And they were the people who actually answered me when I made a phone call to somebody to see whether or not I could find a position. I served almost 5 years there. And during that period of time, I became the assistant to the vice chairman in my 4th year. I basically was the person who was the gopher. I learned very quickly how one got memos from other people to surrender to him, and basically how to condense those memos so he didn't have to read them all in the event that he didn't want to. And beyond that, I had the opportunity to read everything that was in the files in 1979. And Prudential at that time was one of the largest economic institutions in the United States. Not because they were in the world of finance, which they got into later through a series of acquisitions, but because they lent money to everybody. And so what I learned during those 5 years was basically everything but the one thing that I wanted to learn, which was how I can make a mark and how I can make a difference with respect to running an organization. I sat there after I'd been the assistant to the chairman and vice chairman, and I thought to myself, this is great, but I don't want to spend 20 years to get back to this office to fundamentally once again read the same memos that I'm reading today. And so I realized that short-term and long-term, this wasn't a good job for me. And so I went to work for Ted Kennedy. He was running a campaign, and candidly, Prudential also didn't have much use for me at that point either, as it became pretty clear that we were differing as to what my future career path would be. And so I volunteered to work for Ted Kennedy's campaign in New York during that last year that I served in them, and then eventually became a paid New York member of his staff. And during that time, what I found is I've been active in local New York City politics on the lefty side during those 5 years, is that politics was actually the great meritocracy. That politics was actually the thing that most intrigued me. It wasn't just the political world that intrigued me, but what was really intriguing me was running the campaign. The idea that there was always a Tuesday was something I learned during the course of that campaign, which is if you work in politics in the United States, the one thing you know is there's an absolute judgment date, except if you live in Minneapolis. But beyond Minnesota, there is an absolute judgment date, and that judgment date is you win or lose. There's nothing more clear-cut than a political campaign. And so what I learned during that period of time when I worked in his campaign and then did later campaigns was it didn't matter how good your idea was yesterday. It only mattered whether your idea was working today. And it didn't matter whether or not you were brought in, as I was, as a person to basically just make appointments and be a volunteer, a standard sort of, for those of you who come from the United States, one who licks envelopes and basically gets them in the mail. It just mattered the quality of your idea, whether or not you would actually be able to convince people that you could actually come up with an idea that would get more people to vote for you. And so the political system as a meritocracy attracted me, intrigued me, and I thought this is where I want to work. And so after that campaign, I started running other campaigns in New York, and then eventually ran Liz Holtzman's campaign when she ran for district attorney in Kings County, which is Brooklyn, the fourth largest DA's office in the United States. And I ran her campaign. We ran against the Brooklyn machine. And in doing so, I became, at the end of it, she requested that I go into government. And I became what they called a confidential assistant to the district attorney. I'll talk about that a little later. But the one thing that was fascinating to me was when I took my oath of office, I got to sign the page that all previous confidential assistants to the district attorney in Brooklyn, New York had signed, because that's how you get sworn in. And in looking at my predecessors, I found 2 who were convicted, 3 who worked for the mob, 1 who jumped out a window after he had helped one of the key witnesses, the murder incorporates child, jump out a window. And so I had an illustrious sort of predecessors in the job. After Liz, and I worked there for almost 4 years, I went on and started going back and decided I wanted to go back to the political world and started to run political campaigns again. And so I ran campaigns throughout the United States for Democratic senators and governors, and then ran campaigns overseas and joined a firm called the Sawyer Group. It was a fascinating time. The Sawyer Group was the largest political consulting firm on the Democratic side at that time, but this was the 1980s, and for those of you from the United States, you probably know that if you were working on the Democratic political consulting side during the 1980s, there was a guy named Ronald Reagan. And so we weren't winning a lot, but in politics, you never did. We were working a lot, and we became a large political consulting firm around the world. And we did Cory Aquino's campaign, we did Shimon Peres's campaign in Israel, and we did numerous campaigns, most of the campaigns, in Latin America. We sort of were introducing what Alpha Dogs, a book that was written about our firm, said was American-style political campaigning to the rest of the world, for good or for bad. We were basically working with governments and institutions and people who, for the first time, were actually seeing the advent of democracy, the advent of a free channel. Yeah.
What year was the Shimon Peres campaign?
Shimon Peres campaign was 1988. I worked in it in 88. So I could tell from, with Uri Savir and Yossi Balin, because I could tell from the accent you spent some time there. Yeah. And so it was a fascinating time for me, and the political world, basically, the there is no Tuesday concept, became even more and more clear to me. And the meritocracy concept, which is you didn't care where somebody came from, you didn't care what their background is, you didn't care who their parents were, you didn't care how much money they contributed. All you cared about was did they come up with an idea that fundamentally was going to get a voter to be more inclined to vote for you, was one that I understood intuitively and then began even more and more to believe in and helped form sort of the crux of how I view a large part of the world. Well, from there we were asked to start working in corporations because course, having seen what was taking place in the 1980s with the ability of Ronald Reagan to convince so many Americans who didn't agree with him on his actual execution of how he was running the country, but truly believed in the way he articulated his vision and values, corporate CEOs began to realize, as they were basically looking at the restructuring of the American economy, that there was something to what he was doing. His ability to articulate a vision and articulate a value, and his political campaign apparatus, and basically taking that to people and making them become believers in it, was overwhelming sort of the institutions and bureaucracies that were existing in the country at that time. And so for the Sawyer Miller Group, which is what I was a partner of, we decided to get into the corporate world. And we started working for a lot of what you would call folks who were fundamentally at that time trying to reorder the economy. Companies that were going through restructurings, companies that were going through bankruptcies, companies that were going through mergers, companies that were seeing the advent of technology, companies that were fundamentally just seeing massive change became places for us to basically become communication consultants to. And then I bought that firm with some of my partners in the early 90s, and then we later sold it in 1993. We frankly flipped it just a year or two later to an advertising agency, because what was said about us at the time was true, which was we were great architects of theory, and we came up with lots of valuable ideas, but we weren't necessarily implementers of those ideas. And we were farming out that business to advertising agencies and public relations agencies. And so I quickly learned from that don't try to be what you're not, and what we weren't were all those things that we were selling on behalf of our clients, to our clients, but we wanted to own those things ourselves. So I sold it to Bozell, and we became part of Bozell. And then a few years later, what we did during that course of time is we were merged in a combination. Bozell owned a firm called Robinson Lake Lear Montgomery, a terrific firm. And they merged us with them. The New York Times and Washington Post, I think the Washington Post said it was the most brilliant merger that anybody had seen in the area of political communications and business communications. They were Republican, we were Democrat. They were Wall Street, we were manufacturing and information technology. And so 8 partners got together, and within 9 months, rapidly became wealthier than we ever thought we could, more successful than we ever thought was going to take place. And yet, at the end of 10 months, knew that the firm was going to break up within the next year, because culturally, no 8 people further disagreed with each other than the 8 of us could, and did, and violently at times. And so in 1995, I learned that culture trumps success when success is just defined as economic success. If you're merging 2 companies and can't fundamentally have shared vision and shared values, it doesn't matter how successful you are economically. The institution fundamentally is doomed long term, because the cultural issues will overwhelm your economic success, and that's what happened to us. And so in 1996, Robinson Lake Lear Montgomery went their way, very successful firm, became very successful on their own again, and we stuck with Bozell, and then in 1998, my firm was sold to True North. At True North, I became responsible for their advertising and non-advertising businesses, and I also, for the first time, started to acquire firms on my own and started to expand overseas. And I learned that the issues of culture were even more important when one started going outside of the United States. For those of you who live in the United States, think of the cultural differences if you're a New York firm trying to buy a Louisiana business. It's nothing compared to a New York firm trying to work in Asia or Europe. The cultural differences are real. They're fundamental, and since I am in the personal services business, at the end of the day, they're product-oriented. And so we did that. Along the way, I lost partners, I gained new partners. Not everyone agreed with the changes I advocated. But the one thing I learned was, once again, change was actually a positive, and in fact, even though disruptive, it was a positive to basically allow a corporation to grow. And in fact, supercharged growth came through every one of these moments of change. Every single time we sold, got bought, fundamentally changed our business model. In the next couple of years, that's when we got the greatest growth. That July 10th memo I mentioned, we were 1,000, Weber Shandwick was 2,500. Putting it together, I was the 5th CEO in 3 years. The business that had existed at that time was a roll-up of roll-ups. It was making, basically, at that time, just beginning to sort of see its moment, but it was July 10th of 2001. And just 2 months later, of course, was September 11th of 2001. And so I actually inaugurated our company on September 30th, 2 weeks after the terrorist attacks in Washington, D.C. and Pennsylvania. In addition, during that period of time, the dot-com bubble finally burst that March. And we had, like all other firms in marketing services, had relied on technology companies for the preceding 2 years for a large part of our growth. So unprecedented change was before us, and I was the new CEO of this sort of infant organization. Now, what took place at that time was Weber Shandwick had basically been a coalition of companies. Interpublic, which was our parent company, had bought dozens and dozens of companies, rolled them up, and basically declared that they were one company at this period of time. Again, the one thing that was very clear to me in those first couple of days was it was anything but one company. It was a confederation of businesses. And in the first couple of months, my job, and in the next 2 years, was basically to lay off a little over 25% of the staff, to close companies and businesses. I shut down 24 offices, and basically try to reframe and come up with my management team a business strategy that would allow us to succeed in a very competitive environment, but one that was frankly depressed because of the marketing recession that was taking place in 02, 03, and the beginning of 04. It was a tough time, but the one thing I learned, and I think my management team learned during that time, was if you could get people to buy into the fact that you had a vision for where you wanted the company to go, and if they believed that that vision was at the end of the day one that they could trust, would enhance either their ability to see blue sky one day or their economics, and it usually took both, then they would trust you and give you the time to basically work on changing the business. But if you couldn't get them to believe in you, then it didn't matter how much you thought they needed the job. In the end of the day, even in a depressed economy, good people could always find a different place to go. And so our job during those 2 to 3 years was to convince people we had vision, we had values, and that fundamentally at the end of it, they would be in the best place that one could possibly work. And so that was what the effort of my management team was, and that's what we spent all our time doing during those years. Change was necessary, change was important. We decided that fundamentally, if we didn't change everything we were doing, we were never going to get to where we had to be. And for a personal services firm, that basically means you're changing how people work, how they come to work, and what they think about their work. It's the most difficult change possible. It's not an assembly line where you're just trying to figure out how to take a minute or two out of the process. It's not a new product where you're just trying to figure out how to enhance it for your marketplace. It's fundamentally in personal services a requirement that you get people to buy into the vision that you're setting up for the company and then to become part of it. So those are the sort of things that I worked on. Now, as I turn this over to questions, I was asked, how did I get started? What were some of the bullet points of my life? I'll tell you a couple of key things that I found. The one that was probably the most important to me was I was 13 or 14 years old working in New York City. Living in New York City, I lived in Brooklyn, Canarsie kid. And I got an opportunity to be a vendor at Yankee Stadium. And so, I don't remember if I was 13 or 14, but it was somewhere around there. I took the trains to Yankee Stadium, and like any kid who grew up in New York City, there I was in my little white uniform, wearing the hat with the box of peanuts. And I was standing there looking out when an older guy, who was probably at the time 20, but seemed really old, looked at me and said, "What are you doing, kid?" And I said, it's like third inning, and it's, exciting moment. And he said, for a quarter, you could sit out there. And it's a lot easier than carrying around this shit. And he said, and you will enjoy the game a lot more. He said, if you came here to make money, man, you should be out there working to make the money. If you came here to watch the game, find a quarter, go sit down and be comfortable. It was probably one of the most important speeches I ever received in my life because it fundamentally told me what work was all about. Work is all about understanding why you're there. And he taught me that in a way that I have never forgotten. I guess the second thing that I thought about at the time was, what are the mistakes you make in life? My classic was, in this state, I was running a gubernatorial race. It was for a candidate who lost. I took him on the day I was his campaign manager. We had a very, very important meeting with the UAW. And so I met him, and we were both going to go visit the UAW headquarters here in Pennsylvania, in this county. And I showed up in a Datsun, Japanese car. He took a look at me and just said, "Are you insane?" That was actually not what he said. He actually almost broke the steering wheel. He was so angry. And I rapidly realized as I dropped him 4 blocks away from the UAW so that he could walk the 4 blocks away and make sure nobody saw him in a Japanese car. This was during the 1980s when protectionism was rearing its head in the United States. It was the fundamental, probably #1 issue, which is that perception is even more important than any of us think. Doesn't matter how good your ideas are. It doesn't matter how well you can execute those ideas. If you never get a shot to actually demonstrate those ideas because you make a stupid presentation or a bad appearance. Think about the folks who were in the auto company showing up at Congress after having flown into their private jets. Well, frankly, anybody in business would say those private jets make a lot of sense if you have a whole bunch of offices located throughout the world and you need to get to them and still be productive back and forth. But nobody wanted to listen to that in the imagery of what was taking place with asking the government for money. And so their plans got no attention. Their speeches got no thought. Their approach was not even listened to. They were dismissed because of how they showed up. I was dismissed because I let a candidate have to walk 4 blocks away from the UAW and didn't quite understand what it meant to show up in a Japanese car when you were running that race. I guess the third thing I would tell you is, and the last lesson I learned was I worked with Liz Holtzman, as I mentioned, in the Brooklyn DA's office. I was like a lot of people, I was a smart young kid, I thought, able to get things done. We were going to change the world. Liz was a lefty. She became DA. We beat the Brooklyn machine. She was a woman of tremendous, admirable qualities, tough, focused. And one of her things she said after her first week, but before she took office, but after we had won, was she took a tour of the office. And unlike Law and Order and all the other shows you watch, government offices look pretty bad. The working conditions are terrible. We expect our civil servants to actually work in horrendous conditions that nobody should have to work in. And she said, let's paint the offices. They hadn't been painted since the 20s, it looked like. And at least try to make the place look fresh and new and up to date. And I said, well, I'll take that on. I was trying to figure out what I was going to do. So I said, I'll take responsibility for that. Well, when you work with a city, and later I learned when you work with a corporation, and you say, I'll get offices painted, 100 memos maybe later, definitely 7 meetings later, 6 months later, I walked into her office as she was ranting and raving about how I couldn't even get an office painted, and basically said I have to go to the mayor's office to override the forms and bureaucracy in New York City to get a building painted. They had put us on the list for like 2010. This was 1982. And so the mayor's office said, no problem, we'll get it done. And 6 months later, after my constantly calling the mayor's chief assistant, a bridge and tunnel crew showed up in November to paint our office. And the lesson I learned from that is bureaucracy is everybody's enemy. Bureaucracy is fundamentally the evil because there's always a good reason not to do something. There was a long list of offices that needed to be painted in New York City. There was a whole variety of systems that needed to be gone through in New York City to get your office painted. But at the end of the day, what it translates into, it won't get done. So the third and most important lesson I learned as I was going on is bureaucracy is everybody's, frankly, enemy. And, Shakespeare said, kill the lawyers. I'm a lawyer. I'm not necessarily going to buy into that. But killing the bureaucrats is a good thing for you fundamentally to think about as you start out. And I guess the last thing I would say is what I learned in that period of time was how important it was to learn from other people. Liz was a unique person. She was a lefty, active in the Watergate community, had run Watergate hearings as a congresswoman, had run for a law enforcement position, probably the first woman to run for it, one of the largest DA's offices in the world, had done it after she lost the senatorial campaign against Jake Javits, and came into a fundamentally broken system. And what she saw right away was that the crack epidemic had overwhelmed everybody such that it was impossible to basically think about all the other crimes that were taking place and how to handle them. And 2 programs have always struck me as how she basically demonstrated to me the value of having a view, having values, and being willing to fight for them, regardless of what people say. She said that there were 2 problems that she saw right away. One, in Brooklyn, New York, for those of you who know, very strong African-American community and a very strong Hasidic Jewish community sort of coexist in the same neighborhood. Not well in those days. And so crimes were being done by both sides. Blacks against Hasidics, Hasidics against blacks. Most of the time, you would sort of prosecute those crimes, and that would be the end of it. She said this is a ridiculous system of violence, and so she announced that she was going to force Hasidics to work in black institutions and blacks to work in Hasidic institutions, and was panned by every newspaper for being soft in crime as alternative sentencing program. And she stood up to that because her goal was actually to break the cycle of misunderstanding and was willing to take the price of newspapers showing that she was a DA who was soft on crime to do that. And the second one, for those of you who aren't familiar with that type of sort of imagery, was we were suffering in New York at that time from a graffiti breakout. There wasn't a train that fundamentally wasn't being repainted in New York City. Some of you have probably seen that in movies of the era. And so she said graffiti artists will never be sent to jail. Who's kidding who? They're all kids. But what she did do was she said, we'll sentence them so that Saturdays they have to go to the train yards and work with the guys who work on the trains and repaint those trains. That's not fun. Painting your name is fun. Painting it silver gray is not. Again attacked, and again, I think at the end of the day, sent a message to that community and to the whole community at all, which was there are other ways of getting done what people wanted to get done. And so the lesson I learned from that was it doesn't necessarily have to be as obvious to everybody as long as it's obvious to you. And if you believe in what change you're bringing, go for it. Take the price and live through the sort of, fury that it might create. As long as you're willing, in the end, you're probably going to be more successful than anybody else. So those were the messages. Those were the sort of lessons I had. And with that said, I'd like to turn this over to questions.